Hi, Jesse.
How's everybody doing? Good. Okay, I'm waiting for a quorum here. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
We've got Steph is here. Angela's here. Stephen is here. So just a few reminders before we get started here. Today's agenda was circulated, and I just wanted to give you a heads up. We're going to have about 10 minutes of housekeeping. So we'll do our normal attendance and minutes, approval, etc. And then we're going to have 30 minutes of presentation from Dr. Ben Malcolm, and Angela Carter is going to moderate that portion, as well as the 30 minutes of discussion with the subcommittee and full board that follows. And then we're going to switch gears and do some strategic planning and timeline tweaking, have about 30 minutes of discussion for forward outlooks. And then at the last 20 minutes, we'll have 10 minutes of board comments and 10 minutes of public comments. So for folks who are interested in public comments, I wanted to remind you that each person will get 2 to 3 minutes, that any questions you pose will be rhetorical questions. It's not a discussion, rather a comment period. And if you do have public comments, would you please submit them to Nick Riley by providing your full name via chat by 12 p.m. if you wish to do so. Or let's see, no, that won't work because we're doing 30 minutes. 11:30ish by chat to Nick Riley. So let's see, how are we doing on quorum? We've got Mason. Will that do it?
I believe 4 out of 7 is a quorum for this subcommittee.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving forward, we're going to let the recordings be the minutes. And so there won't be a written minutes moving forward. Can we get a movement to approve our minutes?
I move to approve the minutes.
I will second.
Wonderful, thank you. Our minutes are approved. I also wanted to make it known that I'm seeking interest in a co-chair, someone who can help me facilitate our subcommittee meetings and also represent our suggestions to the full board. I'm teaching a mycology class this fall at OSU as part of my professor position over there, and I unfortunately am not available in the Monday 1 to 4 slots. That's exactly when we're having our lab, so we'll be looking at mushrooms over there. And therefore, I need someone to help out with conveying our message to the full board. So think about that. If you're interested, well, let me ask, is there any interest right off the bat, being a co-chair? If not, I'll give it a few more weeks and we'll revisit it next time. Just wanted to put it on folks' radars. I am seeking a co-chair to help facilitate meetings and portray our interest to the full board. Okay, so we did attendance. Oh, we didn't do attendance. We did minutes. I'm going to wait until the end to do attendance as folks trickle in. So I'm going to now turn it over to OHA for a quick update. Jesse or Angie, would you like to give us an update?
Thank you, Jesse. I'll just quickly start and turn it over to Jesse Sweet for any of the rulemaking and timeline updates. For everyone on the line, I'm Angie Albee, the section manager for the new Oregon Psilocybin Services section at OHA. I just wanted to remind everyone I have circulated the job announcements for a couple of the positions that we're recruiting for, and please circulate those throughout all of your networks. We are really excited to build out our team. And I will save additional updates for the full advisory board meeting, which we will be sending all of the documents out for later this afternoon. Thank you. And Jesse, over to you.
Thanks. For the recording, this is Jesse Sweet with OHA. I think you all are familiar with the timelines for rulemaking, but I'm going to go over them again. The full recommendations from the advisory board are due on June 2022. Rules must be adopted by December 22, and OHA must begin accepting applications in January 23. We have identified portions of the rules that are going to need to be adopted sooner. This is essentially what we'll be talking about in the strategic planning session later in the agenda. Because products need to be tested, and because testing labs need to be certified by ORLAP as a precondition for licensure, we're trying to get our recommendations and our rules on a quicker time frame for product requirements. This will allow ORLAP to build their certification requirements, and it will allow labs to successfully apply for licenses once that application period opens. So, you know, I think I've said this same thing a couple different times in a couple different contexts. So, you know, I apologize to those of you who have heard it before, but training and products are the emphasis right now. Chronologically, we need to get those rules nailed down first. So we will be looking to get out in front of those statutory deadlines and do it as early as we can. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesse. Did I understand you correctly that the final suggestions from the full board are due to OHA in June of 2022?
That's correct. That's the language from the measure.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. And with that, I will turn it over to Angela Carter for the intro. Angela, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming. I am excited. This is Angela Carter, just for the record, sorry. I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Benjamin Malcolm. Dr. Ben Malcolm earned his bachelor's degree in pharmacology at UC Santa Barbara prior to his master's in public health and doctorate of pharmacy at Touro University, California. He completed postgraduate residencies in acute care at Scripps Mercy Hospital and psychiatric pharmacy at the University of California, San Diego Health. After residency training, he began his career as an academician at Western University Health Sciences College of Pharmacy and obtained a board certification in psychiatric pharmacy. Currently, he provides psychopharmacology consulting services and a resource and support membership relating to the use of psychedelic and psychotropic medications, spiritpharmacist.com. Dr. Malcolm envisions a society in which access to psychedelic drugs in a variety of safe and supportive settings is available for purposes of psychospiritual well-being, personal development, ceremonial sacraments, and treatment of mental illness. His vision guides his scholarship, education, and service-related professional activity. And so, without further ado, thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Malcolm. And I would love to start the conversation. Do you have a presentation that you are thinking to give? Or
I do not have a formal type of slide deck at all.
Okay.
I did get I have a really nice conversation with Jesse on Tuesday, so I believe that I have a better understanding of kind of like what I'm here for to kind of like speak about. But that sort of timeline I didn't really have much as the way like let's put together something formal. So I do envision this being a little bit more like discussion or conversational. You know, I think that I could just start explaining a little bit more about kind of where I'm coming from and my practice. And I think somewhere in there, we're going to start hitting upon things that the advisory board would find interesting. And so I really invite, any member of the advisory board, if I'm talking, just to kind of, wave your hand or something like that, if you'd like to sort of like ask a question or like expand upon what I'm saying at all.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yes, thank you.
All right. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Angela. I will say that at this point in time, I'm doing something kind of different than a lot of different pharmacists or clinicians out there, in that I'm really focused on this interface between psychiatric medications and psychedelic substances, and have been doing individual consulting as well as consulting for facilitators, providers, and sometimes even organizations around best practices for psychedelics, and essentially sort of helping either persons, providers, or organizations sort of like navigate this interface. So I understand that I was tasked to come and speak with the product subcommittee, but I'm also happy to hear that the measures around or rules around like training are a priority, because I think as like my background as like a clinical psychiatric pharmacist, it's much more about like designing like workflows and like protocols, as well as kind of different type of like safety measures for individuals, much more than that sort of upstream product analytic and testing type of thing. And I believe that this advisory board has kind of looked at the clinical data with psilocybin in depth and produced a kind of like summary document of those studies. So I don't think I necessarily have to rehash that, but I think from the product perspective, obviously there is a disconnect between clinical research and the task that this board is tasked with, is essentially is like, what whole kind of fungal products are we going to permit or able to permit? And in my discussion with Jesse, we talked about how there are so many different types of psilocybin producing fungi out there in the world, and some of them may be stronger than others. Some of them may have different types of secondary alkaloids that are also active, or different types of toxins that could potentially be produced. And Jesse specifically mentioned like a wood lover's paralysis. And I don't know if I have like tons of insight as far as like which product to choose, except for to say that from my understanding, that the vast majority of persons, or maybe the majority of persons out there, are using fairly standard strains of psilocybin mushrooms for the United States, things like psilocybin cubensis types of mushrooms. So, if it were up to me as far as, which products to at least start with, I would probably want to pick something that the public is most familiar with already. Like I wouldn't want to essentially pick a stronger product or a different kind of product and kind of put that out there. I think that's like mostly what I have to say around products at this point in time. I was kind of thinking about this more from the level of training or participant eligibility and things like that. And wow, this board has a monumental task in front of them, because in some ways we have quite a lot of clinical data showing that psilocybin can be helpful, although it's all within this kind of structure of psilocybin assisted therapy. It's using pure psilocybin, and there are several types of restrictive exclusion criteria that are applied to those types of things, where inherently this board is doing something different. It's not necessarily about a medical type of model. So for me, like personally, for example, I have a consulting practice where I will take individuals and give them an hour, essentially have an intake form that they fill out ahead of time, and then we'll go through their medications and conditions and kind of come up with a plan for them. So I think from the perspective of the board, I was thinking about, well, how would I do this? Like if it was just like on me, like the task was on me. And I think that I would like have some type of centralized application portal that is fairly detailed in the amount of information that it asks or captures from people as far as their medical history and the types of medications that they're taking. And I'm pretty sure the board is familiar with some of the what at least at this point science considers like contraindications to psilocybin use, things like psychotic illness or schizophrenia, mania or bipolar 1 types of conditions, as well as probably selective types of personality disorders. And I will say that I get different flavors of consult, and usually it's a person that has mild to moderate levels of anxiety, depression, PTSD, maybe OCD, and they're taking some type of SSRI or SNRI type of antidepressant. But sometimes I do get bipolar 2 conditions and they want that sort of like second opinion, like, am I too bipolar for this? Or is the flavor of my bipolar sort of much more in the realm of depression? And I will say, like, just noticing from people filling out the intake forms is that the persons that have severe mental illness, like the bipolar 1, the schizophrenia, or just like a really kind of decompensated condition, oftentimes have a lot of problems with the intake form in that they're not really able to like fill it out or like find the link, or like scheduling the service with me is difficult in some way. And so like kind of thinking about it from a bird's eye perspective, just like how the person even interacts with the intake form is essentially where my interview process with them begins. And I was kind of thinking for an example of like, well, people can write anything on an intake form, and I don't know if it's like necessary or within the purview or scope of the board or this measure to go and collect collateral and like verify these like types of things. I think for the most part,
I'll tell you that
to
it's not. It won't be. Just
right.
to
So,
add a little
yeah,
context.
thank you, exactly. So if I start like speculating on something, it's really helpful. Yeah, someone chimes in and be like, yes, that is the way it is, or no, you're completely off base. So I kind of think that something that is, I don't think it should take 2 hours to fill out, but something around the realm of like maybe 30 minutes to fill out is probably going to be a helpful like screening tool, as far as like can people function at the level that they're able to completely fill this like application out, could be like one type of like aspect to it. The other thing I was thinking about is that there's all sorts of persons out there with sort of different flavors of things going on. And so sometimes I'll talk with like facilitators or providers, and it's kind of like, well, like who is your sort of ideal person to work with? And they're kind of like, well, it's someone with depression or anxiety. And that sounds fine. But there's, a huge spectrum of types of depression, severities of depression, and histories that kind of come along with those things. And maybe some things that are prognostically better for undergoing psychedelics or using psychedelics, and some things that aren't. So for example, in my intake form, I always ask people about histories of hospitalization or suicidality. And I take, hospitalization is essentially a surrogate marker or a marker that at some point in the past, illness has been severe. And a lot of the times I'll consider, well, I mean, how many times were they hospitalized? What are the circumstances of hospitalization? How much time has elapsed between hospitalization and them kind of coming to me? And so I think like some of these details could be helpful for the board to kind of consider or think about as well. Persons that have been hospitalized, persons that have histories of not so much suicidal ideation. I think that some fleeting thoughts for people with mental illness is very, very common, but essentially like suicide attempts are a lot more concerning, I think, like overall. So I think, like, from the perspective of the board, you probably want to have some type of tool that is able to collect a lot of good information, and then maybe stratify people somehow, as in applications that look like just green lights and there's just like no real issues, and maybe applications that have some things on there that may need to be explored further, or would be better suited to be managed by a particular type of facilitator or provider. And then maybe things on the application form that, I don't know if you could just straight up say like no based on like certain things, but maybe certain pieces of the application, like red flags, that then trigger some other type of secondary process where they actually have to do some more interviewing or work or something to kind of demonstrate that they actually are a reasonable participant for this type of thing overall. And then, yeah, exactly. From the flip side now, I imagine that the beauty of this type of measure is that maybe you're not requiring the facilitator to be a specific type of person or have a specific like type of license. And I think the idea would be that there would be a variety or diversity in types of persons and backgrounds that are providing these types of services to people. And there very well may be some persons that are better equipped to handle particular types of candidates. So that's what I was essentially thinking of. So some type of like centralized application process that stratifies people according to what their responses are in the intake, and then some type of matching algorithm essentially, or maybe an eligibility algorithm. Like, it doesn't have to be so granular that, oh, you can only use psilocybin with these persons, but maybe to handle a participant that does have a suicide attempt in their past or a hospitalization, maybe there are additional types of trainings that the board can offer to them as far as a certification or competency for taking that particular type of participant with a particular type of history. How are we doing?
I just want to jump.
I just want to
jump in. I just want to jump in for a second, if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
I definitely appreciate your concern about minimizing risk, but I do just kind of want to push back a little bit on the way you're characterizing past suicide attempts or suicidal ideation. I find that framing of it to be a bit stigmatizing and perhaps not really grounded in any kind of, scientific evidence. So I just kind of want to draw attention to that, and I think it's kind of a harmful way to frame the issue.
Okay, so you wouldn't favor, I guess, like a history of like suicide attempt as like some type of risk factor, or you feel like that's stigmatizing to people?
I do.
Okay, fair enough.
I think that I appreciate your this is Steph Bars, the thoughtfulness in that the medication could be destabilizing, and how do we potentially capture people who may be even destabilized more. And that is something that we have talked about a lot, is having it be an inclusive, the potential for inclusivity, but also identifying people that, and I like what you're saying about the screening and how extra time and care and attention could be given to those people who we are concerned about may not be as stable. We really struggled with this, ruling out people with a history of whatever, because we don't know. I mean, the research is so limited on and excluding people who have any kind of blip, mental illness, and or cardiac history or whatever it is. So the extra screening could be a way, though, to help assure that there is enough structure in home life or in their friends, and they have perhaps other supports if things don't go or aren't easy, I guess. Too.
Right.
So that's
Yeah.
helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe just to back up, I'm not really trying to say that if you felt suicidal or had a suicide attempt in the past that you should not be eligible for this. I just tend to take it as a marker that there has been instability in the past, particularly if you've been hospitalized or attempted suicide. And some of the strongest risk factors for a second suicide attempt would be a first suicide type of attempt. So I'm not trying to be stigmatic or say like, well, that's just a no-go population, because you're right, that's not what the clinical data reflects. They're talking about treatment-resistant depression, but the treatment-resistant depression they include in clinical trials, essentially their definition is, well, you failed 2 first-line antidepressants, and a lot of the times there is some additional exclusion criteria around suicidality or when it was last active as far as trial inclusion. So I don't think we have like the evidence to say that it's just like a no-go type of thing, but essentially it's a gap in the data right now. And so negative evidence and lack of evidence are completely different things. But exactly, I think that in the implementation of this measure, you've got some really big gaps. And for me personally, I would also think that you would want to favor being conservative in the initial implementation of the measure. Maybe I'll switch gears and talk a little bit about psychiatric meds and psilocybin. I find that in my practice, there's a couple different varieties of persons out there. And a lot of the times persons are talking to me because they want to taper their medications and use psychedelics as a therapy, as a therapeutic type of alternative. However, some other people have different types of intentions. It's essentially, well, I actually appreciate some of the effects of my medications, and I'm not really looking to go off of them. However, there's, essentially a spiritual type of experience that I don't feel like I've had that I'm looking to have here. And in all of the clinical trials that they've done so far, I think with the exception of depression, anxiety associated with a life-threatening illness, it's essentially been a treatment or a series of psilocybin sessions. If you look at alcohol use disorder, smoking cessation, treatment-resistant depression, there are kind of 2 to 3, maybe smoking cessation. That trial is even 4 sessions. And similarly, right now, we don't have like a lot of data for OCD, but the one case series that's out there was essentially a series of psilocybin sessions. So again, like not saying that, well, one treatment is not enough. They need to do this a number of times. But if you're looking at the way the evidence is laid out right now for the treatment of mental illness, it's essentially a series of treatments. So I kind of wonder, again, like I don't have much data to support this, but a sort of theoretical concern is that persons may abruptly stop their antidepressants or taper off very rapidly, go under one psilocybin session, and essentially find themselves on the backside in an antidepressant withdrawal with a lot of their kind of core issues activated at the surface, and maybe not enough support in that situation, or not another session kind of lined up. And if bad outcomes occur there, then it's going to look like, well, geez, like this psilocybin treatment did this, and it could actually be related to what they did with their medications before the psilocybin session, or lack of kind of like ongoing support as things keep continuing. So I'm kind of all for psilocybin being an alternative treatment for these types of things, but I guess like one other thing that I come across a lot in my practice is essentially, should you taper? how long should you taper? How long should you wait? And these are all questions that the literature is just kind of missing at the moment. There's not one study out there that combines psilocybin with an SSRI in kind of a phase 1, like clinical lab type of thing right now. So that's like another kind of like concern that I had in all of this is kind of like, okay, well, if the data demonstrates that to really be helpful for treatment-resistant depression or OCD, you need a series of these things. And it's also in the environment in which the person is supported over a period of 6 months. And even before that, to taper off their medication, like, is that going to be problematic for people that are doing one session, maybe don't have that level of support, and have kind of read the news and think like, well, I'm going to stop my med and have a mystical experience and then emerge kind of healed or better. So I was kind of thinking if for participants themselves, depending on what kind of things that they would fill out on a centralized application, the participant may actually be required to do like some level of training and education. And there may be different trainings and education sort of depending on their application and what they fill out.
I mean, these are good points that you're raising, regarding tapering off of medications. I think that's important to consider. We've talked about it a little bit. I think from our perspective, probably what we can realistically achieve is to just kind of the education that you're talking about, really educating people to make sure they understand that if they are taking medications, they should, confer with a healthcare professional. But I think that's probably likely kind of the extent of what we can achieve through this program. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts or anyone else's on that.
Well, I guess like, is there like the potential for like establishment of like liaison types of services or things of that nature, or it's literally just kind of go back to your doctor? And so over 50% of antidepressants are prescribed from primary practice, and primary practice doctors typically aren't that great at helping persons taper antidepressants and maybe wouldn't be that well versed in the use of psilocybin either.
Yeah, that's really an issue. I think that reaching out to people to provide that education and would be really important. I think that's very true.
Yeah, we're reaching out to people, but I was almost thinking that like maybe like you say you're taking antidepressants, maybe that triggers some type of, you have to complete some type of, I don't know, video training or something like that to kind of clarify, well, if you really are using psilocybin as a replacement, this is the sort of like timeline for tapering and things that you may be considering. Whereas if you're just trying to have a spiritual experience but not discontinue your antidepressant, like how is your preparation going to be different in that type of like scenario or case? And I'm using antidepressants because they're probably the most common thing that people are taking, where psilocybin could be a beneficial alternative, but certainly similar considerations could be made for other types of medication classes too.
It's a good thought. I just don't know that we want to be in a position of policing, people and verifying that they've done what they say they do. And I think kind of the default would be to trust. But I do think that primary care physicians and other healthcare providers will play an important role here. Yeah. Without a doubt. And I think there is a real lack of understanding.
Yeah, well, maybe there's something that could be done from not necessarily like making the participants do these things and not necessarily making their doctors either, but maybe there's something that the Oregon Health Association can offer, some CME credits for physicians or providers, prescribers, to essentially, get some CME, because they're sort of incentivized to do that to keep up their license anyway. But make it specific for something for their state and their patients. And, if you make it a free CME that's offered by, the state of Oregon, then, perhaps you would get a good uptake as far as like providers getting on board and getting some more understanding around these types of like concerns that people may be having, or essentially empowering them to have conversations about this with their patients too, instead of having it be sort of like, well, I've got my medical doctor over here and the kind of spiritual use of psilocybin over there, and there's this kind of like firewall between them, and I don't dare mention something to my doctor about it because they're gonna balk and say I shouldn't do it, and then so I don't know what your what the kind of general climate is amongst like providers. We know how the public voted on it, but it'd be interesting. I don't know if you have any data about what the medical providers in the state actually like think or feel about the measure.
I think it's in part to stuff bars complicated because of a Schedule 1 drug. And how the boards are reluctant, I think, so far to be very vocal, or they're just not supporting it. But boy, it's such a good point, and I love that idea of education provided. Is Jesse or Angie, I'm curious, is there any possibility to explore that a little bit about providing education for the medical providers on how to talk with their clients, because they will be coming to ask. Is there any precedent for that, or just curious?
So this is Jesse with OHA. I am not aware of a precedent for that, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. So I think that's something that we would need to look into further and explore the limits of what Oregon Health Authority can do as an agency.
I don't know about in the state of Oregon, but for example, I know in the state of California, because of the opioid epidemic, it was the California Dental Association that said, you need, I can't remember how many units of CE, they needed 16 or 20 or 32 every other year. But, we're essentially mandating that 2 of those CE hours have to do with opioids, because that was one place the persons would go to seek opioids, is essentially like the dentist's office. So I don't know about like a mandate, because I think that's like more in response to like a public health crisis, which is like a very different situation than what you guys are considering, or are you all considering. But yeah, like I guess what I'm saying is like there has been like some precedent for like different CME providers for groups to essentially say like, we would really like you to get up to speed on these specific types of things. And I think like most like for me as a pharmacist, right, like if you want good CE, you usually have to pay for it. But the Board of Pharmacy in California will give you 1 free hour every single year because it's the Board of Pharmacy updates, right? So maybe there's some type of process like that where it could be like, just heavily advertised and free, and that would be enough of an incentive to get many people to take it.
It's a really good idea.
Would the Board of Pharmacy be? Could we tap them to get involved? Because this area of problems and with taking antipsychotics or benzos or SSRIs or SNRIs that are potentially, and what I understand, they more may mute the effect. So far, I think from the literature is what we know, that there's not necessarily going to be besides going off of your medications and destabilizing what it was that you were being treated for with those prescription meds. It's the the drugs. I'm hugely concerned about how this is managed. in Measure 109 and how it's rolled out. So the Board of Pharmacy, is there a way to get them involved in educating providers, do you think? Not just pharmacists.
I would hope so. I don't know. Like I do something different than a lot of pharmacists in my profession, and part of the sadness in the profession of pharmacy to me is that there's a lot of discussion about pharmacists being the drug experts, but when it comes to things that are in the C1 category, whether it be cannabis or psilocybin, things that have like good clinical data, essentially the stance is still, well, until the federal government changes their rules, that we're just going to play by the rules of the federal government and essentially just be hands off. So I don't know if it's a drug and it's a society. To me, it squarely falls in the purview of pharmacy, or that should be like part of their like scope. But it would be interesting to understand just what their level of interest is in all of this. Yeah.
That's
Hey,
such a great point. Sorry, Jesse, go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Mason. So I'm curious, for those of us without medical backgrounds, if you could take a step back and discuss the classes of drugs that you're referring to, potentially the mechanisms of the underlying diseases they're intended to treat, and if there are patterns, a potential for interaction between psilocybin and some of these drugs, or your main concern with tapering the drugs down, how that happens, and I guess a follow-up, it's about 10 questions, but then how you would potentially route people based on those ideas.
Yeah. So the conditions that I consider to be like contraindicated are essentially like schizophrenia and psychotic disorders. So schizoaffective, I would also like put in there, and bipolar 1 conditions, or a person that has a history of mania, and oftentimes mania that's resulted in hospitalization. So that's like the condition perspective, and these conditions are essentially characterized by sometimes expanded ranges of thoughts and emotions, difficulty forming logical or linear types of like thought forms. And schizophrenia, as like a word root, actually means split-minded, and it doesn't refer to like a split personality disorder. It essentially just refers to it's a thought problem or a thinking problem in which they're kind of split. It's sort of I don't know. I could think of like some simple analogies, but I think I'm just sort of like speculating on like how true they are. But I'll essentially, say that there's certain types of psychiatric conditions that are characterized by disorganization of thoughts, and oftentimes these conditions, bipolar 1 or schizophrenia, are treated with atypical antipsychotics and or mood stabilizers. And so the atypical antipsychotics block serotonin 2A receptors, and these are the exact receptors that psilocybin stimulates. So beyond, there's this kind of maybe concern about like a disorganized thought pattern at baseline, a lot of the medications that these persons are going to be taking are going to directly interfere with the action of psilocybin. And if they removed those medications, then they would essentially be using a substance that almost does the polar opposite of what the medication that they were taking does. And so I kind of think a lot of these antipsychotics or mood stabilizers are sedating types of medications. They're used off-label for sleep. Many of the mood stabilizers are also anti-epileptics, so they're essentially designed to like calm electrical storms within the brain. So I think a lot of the times, even mania is characterized by thoughts going too fast, persons being like kind of hyperverbal or having a pressure to keep speaking. And so a lot of these medications are designed to essentially slow them down. Whereas I think of things like psychedelics as inherently being activating and potentially speeding things up somewhat. So with those types of persons, bipolar 1 and psychotic illnesses, as well as the medications they're taking, the atypical antipsychotics interact pretty strongly with psilocybin. And this is actually probably where the best data is as far as like drug interactions. There's been a number of experiments that have looked at atypical antipsychotics or antipsychotics that block the serotonin 2A receptor. And across the board, every time they find psilocybin experiences a diminished somewhere between 40 and 90+%. So they really tend to interfere with the effects overall. In the realm of mood stabilizers, there's one oddball. It's a chemical element, it's lithium. And lithium is probably the only drug that I know of that seems definitively dangerous in combination with psilocybin. There's something about lithium that changes the way the cells respond to psychedelics, and instead of producing the characteristic psychedelic effects, it tends to produce more dysphoric effects, so more like bad trip or challenging experience, but also seizures has been the really big red flag that's come up with classic psychedelics and lithium. So I think that particularly the atypical antipsychotics and lithium are fairly high concern, either because of completely abolishing the effects, dangerous drug interactions or seizures with lithium, and or the actual underlying condition or illness of the person themselves. All that said, it's still not very cut and dry, because a lot of these atypical antipsychotics are indicated in low doses as adjuncts for treatment refractory depression. You see psychiatrists using low doses of atypical antipsychotics for insomnia, maybe even management of generalized anxiety disorder sometimes. And you also see lithium as an agent that's used as an alternative in treatment refractory depression when they failed a number of those sort of first line SSRI types of antidepressants. So just being on lithium or just being on an atypical antipsychotic probably isn't enough to say, well, geez, that person is like not a candidate. But from my pharmacy process, it's a lot of like reverse engineering, right? Because oftentimes I'm starting with med lists and reverse engineering to conditions, right? Where the physician is always starting with signs and symptoms, diagnosis, and then going to medication. So essentially my perspective is somewhat a reverse engineering process sometimes. So that's what I'll say about like contraindicated conditions in meds. Are we good there? Do we have questions there?
Yeah, that's helpful. We have quite a varied background on this.
Okay.
So it's helpful at least for me to hear.
Okay. And now the other side of it, right? So a psilocybin assisted therapy now has some positive evidence for treatment resistant depression. What else does it have? Obsessive compulsive disorder, substance use disorders like alcohol and tobacco cessation. There are no clinical trials of psilocybin for PTSD that have been completed at this time, but essentially whether it's depression, anxiety, panic disorders, PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, all of these conditions, if you go to psychiatric treatment guidelines that are put out by the American Psychiatric Association, will say the first line therapies for those are the SSRI or SNRI types of antidepressants. And if those don't work, try a different one. If that doesn't work, try a different one. So oftentimes these algorithms for these conditions are very much characterized by SSRIs or SNRIs being the kind of backbone of things. And then depending on how well it works, what symptoms it treats and it doesn't, or potentially even sometimes what kind of side effects it causes, there may be other things added, like benzodiazepines, right? If there's a high component of anxiety and panic, like stimulants, if there's a lot of sort of fatigue and low energy, or maybe one of these atypical antipsychotics if insomnia is a big type of problem, or a sleep aid, something like Ambien or Zolpidem. So I think that like all of these types of persons, right, whether the underlying conditions and the sort of med combinations are essentially probably the bread and butter of like who could actually benefit from psilocybin as a mental health treatment. But then again, like from your perspective, the big difference or change compared to the clinical literature is like, well, they taper all those meds out and like wash them out, whereas it just seems in a real world environment that's not going to be feasible for people to do all the time, and it's probably not really even aligned with what they want to do a lot of the time either. So no, none of those medications I would say are absolutely contraindicated with psilocybin. I do think that particularly like the SSRIs or SNRIs and benzodiazepines tend to take the edge off psilocybin's effects or reduce the effects, but they don't abolish them. And I will say like at least the people that I talk to in my practice, a good half of them get pretty strong and potent effects of psilocybin while taking their SSRI or SNRI type of antidepressant. And with benzodiazepines, again, you have all the way from someone that uses a 0.5 milligram of lorazepam once a month when they go on business travel and they have some anxiety about flying, all the way to people that are taking 2 milligrams of Xanax 3 times a day. And you know, for that type of person, again, it's not like, well, that use pattern precludes use of psilocybin, but that use pattern probably indicates that the person is heavily dependent on benzodiazepines, maybe has a benzodiazepine type of like use disorder. And yeah, I get to wondering like, well, how much support do they need, and what are they going to do with their benzodiazepine? Because abruptly stopping that much benzodiazepine could really put you at risk for having a severe withdrawal syndrome or a seizure. And you know, even cutting it in half for a week ahead of time, they're likely to be in a pretty serious type of withdrawal with a lot of like panic and insomnia. And then, yeah, I guess I don't know, right? Like I hear some people saying, well, geez, psilocybin really helped me taper my antidepressants. Like it did something that helped me through the withdrawal. And then it seems like other people I talk to, particularly like microdosing the psychedelic as a, psychedelic means mind manifesting or an amplifier of consciousness. So I guess I get concerned about potentially amplifying withdrawal syndromes without really providing much in the way of support or resolution. I'm going to stop there again. Yeah.
I really like what you said earlier about medical associations or other professional associations just sort of turning a blind eye to Schedule I substances, and I think that is a bit irresponsible, like you said.
Incredibly irresponsible.
Yeah, I mean, these are out there. People are using them. You don't want to discourage people from discussing them with providers openly. So I just thought that was a great point.
Yeah.
And I also agree with everything you just said. I think that was quite helpful discussing the different medications. I do always like to put the psilocybin services a little bit in context, just to say that, in Oregon, the state also regulates cannabis and alcohol, and we don't go and verify that people have taken off their meds to consume those substances. So by comparison, this is actually significantly safer, at least in respect to the fact that people are being supervised very closely, and there will be mechanisms to get additional medical services if they're necessary. But what you said was fantastic. I just always like to kind of point that out, because I think it's easy to forget that. I forget it myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just it, is like, exactly. It's kind of like, my gosh, people are drinking pints of whiskey with their SSRIs and benzodiazepines and stimulants and things like that all day long, right? But this is the first, and we're bringing psychedelics back, right? And so I think, like, for me personally, right, there's this sort of like yeah, like on the one hand, I can look at the data over and over again. It's like, yes, Ben, they're safe. Like it's safe. Like just where is the smoking gun for all of this like harm here? And like considering like all of these things, right? So it's like a lot of what I'm talking about would sort of be like, well, these are just kind of like best practices from the clinical conversations I have. But yeah, the task that you guys have as a board is much different as far as just this is yeah, we're not here to like police people around it. Essentially, just make sure that they have right access to the education probably ahead of time, and then right channels that they're aware of that if things they feel off balance, they feel rough, they did something different with their medications, and now they're feeling some certain way that they have access to additional type of support. And I think that that's probably a really great start. Uh,
This is Angela Carter. May I
yeah,
ask sort of
yeah,
a
go ahead,
nitpicky question
please.
about details? I've read a decent amount about serotonin receptor internalization during use of SSRIs and
Mhm.
other medications that have an impact on serotonin receptors, including the 5-HT2A receptor. And I am wondering if, there's the washout period for the drug, but then there's the period of time where those receptors have to repopulate to reach sort of
Yeah,
a natural state again. Do you
yeah,
have a sense of how long that takes so that someone going in for a facilitated session could have maybe an optimal time frame for after they stop?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think that the exact time frame is generally unclear at the moment. However, I will say that I tend to take it from like if someone were to start an SSRI type of antidepressant, we wouldn't expect them to feel better the first day or two that they started taking that antidepressant. We essentially say, well, this medication is probably going to take 2 to 4 weeks to begin working, and maybe more like 4 to 6, 4 to 8 weeks to reach a full therapeutic effect. And we think that that therapeutic effect, when it is provided, is a result of some type of neuroadaptation event. So I've been kind of taking this time frame and thinking, well, yeah, the worst of an SSRI withdrawal period is usually days more like 5 through 14. Person starts kind of turning a corner around week 3 or so. So I'm kind of thinking that same time frame of like 4 to 6 weeks could be a reasonable time frame to expect the brain to sort of return to a similar baseline type of state. And not with psilocybin, but with MDMA, for example, there was sort of a rehash of their phase 2 data that they did, and they found that persons that had tapered an antidepressant and been off for a mean of 25 days, so that's about 3.5 weeks, and underwent an MDMA session, wait a month, another MDMA session, so 2 sessions spaced a month apart, measure their PTSD symptoms, I think between 1 and 3 months after that. And they were finding that people that had to taper SSRIs were getting less clinical benefit than the ones that didn't have to taper. However, in the first phase 3 trial of MDMA, where they were using 3 sessions spaced a month apart, this signal dried up, and all of a sudden they didn't see it anymore. So I'm kind of taking away from this again that like, truly for like the sorts of results that they see in trials, which is not really what you're trying to achieve here, right? But for those results, people probably need to set up a series of sessions, and at least with MDMA and SSRIs, it probably should be 3 sessions, because that first session coming off of your SSRI could be weaker. It may not be as effective, and you're going to play catch up essentially with the other persons on sessions 2 and 3. So yeah, it's a little bit tricky in some ways because if the worst of SSRI withdrawal is over in around 2 weeks, then I would expect the person wants to go ahead and get started with things because they're probably not feeling that great overall. Yet saying, well, wait 8 weeks to be sure that your receptors are resensitized. First of all, I don't even have any data that really proves that, right? It's just based upon what I know about how long it takes to start working. And then second of all, it's like, well, that interim period of 8 weeks where they're just kind of waiting to do something that may make them feel better, but they haven't done it yet, could actually be sort of a high risk period in its own right as well. So I've kind of, my personal practice with psilocybin, because it's different than MDMA, right? With MDMA, I'm pretty sure it's not going to work. It's just going to kind of fall flat on its face. And there are mechanistic reasons to understand that MDMA has a stronger interaction potential with the SSRIs and psilocybin. For the people that I see, I've essentially said, well, you don't know. You don't know if you want to taper. You don't know if you need to taper. You don't know how long to wait if you should taper. So why don't you try a test dose? Why don't you try 0.3 grams of dried mushroom, something that's on the heavier end of a microdose, and gauge if there's any type of sensitivity or effect there. And similarly, as people are tapered off or they're tapering off, maybe you can try a microdose of psilocybin once a week to gauge if there's a sensitivity or effect there. I don't know / don't think that there's necessarily really a mechanism that you have built in for that, but that could be like something to think about as an option, is like, could some of these centers essentially offer people test doses, maybe on the premises or something like that, to understand before they go for larger types of experiences, whether it's likely to have significant effects for them or not. And without more data, that's kind of, I've just been sort of like, well, you can take small doses in safe environments and maybe check for yourself for your individual situation, but that's sort of the best I have as far as a magic number, as far as like how many weeks to wait and things like that.
Thank you. I'm seeing that we have reached the end of our hour. Thank you so much for all of this wonderful information. I am wondering if we have any public comments at this time. No, okay. So, are there any closing thoughts that you would like to share with us before we wrap up today's wonderful presentation?
No, I think just, thank you again to the board for considering me as a speaker. And yeah, I'm here. You know how to get a hold of me. I feel like you probably have a ton of work to do and many things to consider. And it sounds like you've got about a year to get some of the final rules in. So, you've heard a lot more about what I do and kind of my perspective on things, and would just encourage y'all to continue to reach out in this process if more things come up that sort of like, oh yeah, he might have a suggestion or a perspective for that. I guess it's just a true pleasure and honor to be involved in any way, in shape or form, as far as shaping legislation and policy around these things. And just incredible amounts of gratitude for being in a position to speak and offer any type of suggestion.
Thank you. It was just really helpful and nice to meet you.
Yes. Nice to meet you too, Mason. Everyone else.
So much. Yes. You are more than welcome to stay and hang out and watch us talk if you would like to, if you're interested in the discussion, but you're also welcome to go about your day and do other things that you need to do as well, whichever you would prefer.
Okay, I'll probably kind of mute myself and go off into the background and listen like a fly on the wall.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming today. Very much appreciated.
Thank you so much, Angela.
All right. Thank you, Ben, for that fascinating presentation. It's very helpful to get all this info and your perspectives. And thanks, Angela, for moderating that section. I would like to switch gears and do a little bit of chatting amongst the subcommittee and board on our strategic plans and timelines. So they've shifted a little bit, given the progress that we've made so far and what lies ahead of us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have some slides for us. So here is an overview of the product's workflow that we initially proposed. And we've been talking a lot about the front end of this pipeline. So what are the products that we're considering, and what species those are going to include. And so on the second slide, I have a timeline for potentially coming to the full board with some suggestions. And I'm hoping what we can do now that we've heard from our excellent line of speakers is move to more discussions focused on coming to consensus around this first portion. So what species and what products and how. And then pivoting to this second portion on extractions, are extractions allowed, testing, working with our ORLAP partners on how best to implement testing, and quantifying psilocybin in whatever products we end up landing on. And as Jesse Sweet highlighted, all of this is necessary foundational work for not only the board to move forward, but also the other subcommittees to build on these topics. So this is just an outline, definitely open to feedback and rearrangement if that's necessary. But I wanted to put up an updated timeline. So I've shown this Gantt chart before, and I've moved things back a little bit because we've actually, in our first 3 months together, covered quite a bit of ground on the diversity of products that are potential, that we have the potential to endorse and produce, and also a discussion about species diversity and cultivation methods, which should not be allowed, in the logic for why. So what I'd like to do now is pivot with the help of our OHA partners from ORLAP to discussions about testing, quantifications, extractions, and I highlighted in pink here 2 goals for full board discussions. So my hope is that we can come to consensus amongst ourselves in our first September meeting. And then we have a little bit of time with the full board in late September to put our recommendations for product and species diversity to vote first amongst ourselves and then the full board. And in the meantime, pivot our discussions internally on the subcommittee to extractions, quantification, and testing. And then later, facilities, occupational hazards, packaging, transport, etc. So hopefully we can have another full board discussion and vote in early February, January, February 2022. Any good game plan has some spillover time for additional discussion, of course, and then our final deliveries to OHA in June of 2022. So again, this is just one idea. It's an outline. If folks have thoughts, please chime in. But to start our discussion, I put a few of our key questions in this last slide. So products related questions, these are the questions that I hope we can come to consensus on earlier rather than later for our September full board meeting. What species are we talking about and why? And what product types are we going to suggest, potentially delivery methods? Will cultivation techniques or substrates be specified or limited? And if extracts are permitted, what kinds of extraction methods and solvents can be used? So again, please jump in if you see any additions, adds, or edits. I see these questions really feeding into the work of other subcommittees. For example, licensing. What are the requirements for disposing of psychoactive material? Do those materials lose potency over time? And if so, when do the testing results sort of expire? What about serving size and maximum dose for each training session, administration session? So training related questions. And then here at the bottom, I have sets of testing questions, and this is what I hope we pivot to in the near future. So specifically, what analytes will labs be testing for? What is a test batch size, and how frequently will OHA require those tests? What are the production limits for manufacturers at initial licensure? So that's another licensing interface. How about the process for changing these limits? Of course, we'll be working to implement these rules and then change them as we see the rubber hit the road. And will these test results have an expiration date? After testing a few questions, what information will be required on product labels? Are there specifics for the kind of packaging used? Specifically, does the packaging need to be child resistant? And then how can we modify metric or other tracking systems to uniquely accommodate aspects of fungal biology rather than their initial purpose, which is plant biology? So I want to leave this up and just ask folks if they have any other comments or thoughts, additions on this set of questions or the tasks that lay ahead of us, the timeline that I've laid out.
This looks really great, Jesse. Thank you.
Agreed. Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Food for thought.
I think with the product related questions, I think these are very well articulated, and we should, move towards coming to consensus on them, uh, you know, as quickly as we can, probably.
So we can have a discussion and potentially a vote today on some of these initial questions around species and product diversity. Want to also invite our OHA partners a chance to contribute here. Jesse, Sweet, or Angie, if you have thoughts or additions to the questions, or if it's possible to work through some of these today, we definitely have the time.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. This is an excellent organization of the questions, and the way that you presented them chronologically is the way that I think we need to approach them. Specifically, the product types and allowable subspecies or subspecies, those are going to be foundational for how the testing rules get built. So I think you've presented them in the exact right order.
So as a reminder, the research subcommittee submitted their initial findings on the timeline that's outlined in the measure. And their suggestion was to focus, at least initially, on Psilocybe cubensis in terms of species diversity. And there have been discussion of other species. I guess I'd like to open up a conversation for logic around inclusion of various species and the timeline for doing that. I think it's also important to remember what we initially recommend is not the final end game. We can add, and that's where I think outlining the process for changing suggestions over time is equally important. Thoughts or discussion there?
I think it's helpful to keep the range pretty narrow at the start. So I don't have an issue with limiting it to a single species, although I could also see offering an additional one or two, but I think keeping it pretty narrow is just going to simplify things a lot in terms of compliance, and that's going to be very helpful to OHA, I think, and to people working in the industry as well.
Yeah, that's very insightful. It's important to keep in mind that, at least initially, when resources are limited on the compliance side to ensure consumer safety, it's better to focus and then to build from there rather than the opposite. I will say the logic that I've been using for thinking about this question, which species, has been so far, which have a safe history of usage, and there are a few there. Cubensis is widely cultivated. Most of the strains that are being cultivated now in the underground space are cubensis, so there's no lack of strain diversity there within one species, though we're using words like limited. The other logic I've been using are what resources are available. So for example, genomes and genes, species level barcode genes, and are those accurately annotated such that we can use modern techniques like DNA sequencing to identify species. And again, there are a few front runners, cubensis in the very front. So together, those criteria lead me to think Cubensis is a clear candidate for putting forward for our initial focus. And I would be ready to put that up for a vote. Am I allowed to move to vote on things as the moderator?
Yes, you can move to vote as the moderator or the chair. What I might suggest for this is that we take a straw poll on each item, and I'll record the results of those items over the next couple meetings, and then we take a formal vote in advance of the September meeting, which contains everything that we agreed on these informal straw polls.
So straw poll is like a vote, but not official.
Yeah, we didn't notice a vote in the agenda, so that's why I'm using the word straw poll, which really doesn't have any meaning. It's an informal vote.
Okay.
So this is kind of getting at my earlier confusion regarding agendas, right? So it seems like if the subcommittee can't vote on anything without notifying, without specifying it in the agenda beforehand, it seems incredibly restrictive, and it seems kind of counterintuitive that we can't just decide to vote on something. That seems like that's a kind of ordinary conduct of a committee, right?
Yeah, Mason, and I know you've raised this issue before. What I'd suggest is that I think we have a good path forward in this instance, and for considering this issue further in the future, I'm going to take it offline and provide some resources which will help everybody have a better understanding of what needs to be in our notices and what we can do going forward.
Well, that
But
sounds
Mason,
fine.
this is Rachel, for the record. I might suggest that because we have not finalized our bylaws. And I think much work does need to be done on our bylaws to, advise the subcommittees and how they can operate. And I'm wondering if we can't make sense of this there, right? Understanding that subcommittees they're not made up of board members. But we are a resource, right? The function of the subcommittees is to be a resource to the board, understanding that no decisions will be passed on as recommendations to OHA unless the board approves it. So there's some baked in, accountability and checks and balances here. And so my proposal is that subcommittees are allowed to discuss and vote on things at will, right? Because we're really informative bodies and not decision-making bodies. Because I understand and respect that these subcommittees need some flexibility to get things done and come to a consensus around ideas and recommendations to the actual board.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you
that's
for
a good
clarifying
idea.
that. I had forgotten that, Rachel. Thank you for clarifying. So it sounds to me like the early September meeting, we should plan our next meeting, early September, we should plan to, I think that's right. Yeah, that's right. That we should plan to take vote on our products related questions and prepare some suggestions for a vote by the full board. Is that correct?
I mean, I don't, I'm not trying to rush a vote on this. I just think that it's kind of implicit, in being a subcommittee that you're going to vote on things periodically. That's actually how committees usually operate. They're continually voting on things. And so I don't think there's anything preventing us from voting, but I'm just more concerned with like moving forward. How do we address this kind of issue? And I think Rachel's suggestion is pretty good, that maybe we can just kind of codify that so that it's clear. Because otherwise I'm going to end up putting vote in every single item on my agenda, just so that that doesn't make any sense.
Well, I think there is some clarity that can be added to the process, but if it's all right with you all, I'd like to focus on the content here and the products related questions. So for species diversity, that would be my suggestion. And Jesse, would you like to do a straw poll today, or would you like to wait until the next meeting?
I would like to do, if everybody is prepared to offer their opinion on this, I would like to do a straw poll today, and then we'll bring a formal motion at the next meeting for this item and any other items that have been decided at the next meeting.
Okay.
And
Well,
I'll make sure it's properly noticed on the agenda.
great, thank you. In that case, I would like to move to focus at least initially on Psilocybe cubensis. I'd like to move to take a straw poll.
I'll second your motion.
And so now, Jesse, do you go down the attendance and get yeses and nos from people who are present?
Yes, I think that's a good way to proceed. I can call out the roll if you would prefer me to do that.
Sure.
And I'll just go on the order at which you are appearing on my screen, rather than trying to alphabetize. So Jesse Euling, you are in my top left array.
Yeah.
Yes, okay. And Angie Carter.
Oh, yes, thank you.
And I believe that's Steph Barr's screen
Yes,
name.
that's right. Sorry, that's not sure exactly how to change that, but that's, and I'm yes.
Okay, thank you. And we also have Mason Marks.
I vote yes, but it's a soft yes.
Okay, noted. And Dr. Rachel Knox.
Just mute challenges here. Yes.
All right, thank you. So that's all 5 expressing a yes opinion, with it noted that Mason Marks' opinion is a qualified yes.
So why not make it official so we can move on to more important things and not waste time next meeting? It's just, you know, that would be my recommendation. What's the point in just, you know?
The point is compliance with Oregon's public meetings laws, and that's the point on which I would like to provide more information to all subcommittees on a go-forward basis.
Well, what about that what about voting on an issue violates public meeting laws?
Specifically, it violates the notice requirement that the public be
How
put.
so? Can you, where does it, what does it violate exactly?
I think this is frankly a waste of time to do.
No, I'd like to know. I think it's helpful to clarify. People want to know these things.
The public needs to be put on reasonable notice of the items to be discussed and the actions to be taken. I'm going to email everybody a reference on this. You know, it's not a debate. We'll seek further clarification from DOJ if that's necessary.
That's what I've asked for, a reference. That's perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
So I want to refocus our discussion. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left to discuss our key questions. And I'd like to pivot to product diversity and delivery methods. So we've heard from a slew of fascinating people on product diversity, and we've talked about whole mushroom cultivation or powdered mushroom products. We've talked about hyphal cultivation. We've heard that chemical biosynthesis or heterologous gene expression in other organisms is possible. We haven't had an expert come to speak on this topic yet. And I suppose I'd like to put forward a few thoughts for pros and cons of each. There are many ways to produce psilocybin. I think growing mushrooms or hyphae are probably the easiest and most straightforward. They also have the lowest barrier to entry for folks interested in entering the market financially, it sounds like from our speakers. The chemical synthesis and heterologous gene expression, I think come with their own complexities that we don't quite fully understand. We haven't heard about those yet. So I would like to move to have another straw poll on product diversity. And my suggestion is to focus on whole mushrooms and hyphal cultivation.
Could I rephrase the motion if you mind? I want to make sure that we know what we're talking about specifically. You used the word focus, and I just wanted to clarify that by focusing on whole mushroom cultivation, the proposal would be to prohibit chemical synthesis and extraction. If that was indeed your intent.
Not necessarily to prohibit extraction. I see the extraction process as a separate process. I'm simply referring to how we produce the psilocybin. So if we're growing mushrooms or hyphae from those fungal species, or making those products synthetically in essentially in vials without any live organism. Or yet the fourth option to use the genes that we know are involved in the biosynthetic pathways for psilocybin and put those genes in a genetically modified way into other organisms. So there are four methods for potentially producing psilocybin, and I'm suggesting to vote to promote the first two, whole mushrooms and hyphal cultivation.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
And Jesse, I'm sorry, I just need to clarify, this is Steph Bars. Does that exclude then, I think you just said it does, the way mushrooms are delivered during research, synthesized?
Do you mean what kinds of products will be given to patients?
I do.
Yeah, I see those, and I could see your confusion in the way that it's phrased here. I see those as separate issues in terms of what products are possible from a manufacturer side, and then the product diversity for providers to give to patients. I see those as separate issues. So I was referring to the first portion of that statement, what products manufacturers are able to produce. Does that clarify?
No. Well, would there still be an option to discuss having, and I'm just thinking about how people might utilize an administration session in a small capsule that's, a very certain dose and potency. And that's, I'm thinking of my elderly hospice patients specifically, and not wanting them to have to chew a whole bunch of mushrooms. So
yes, it's a great point. Thank you for clarifying. So what I'm suggesting we vote on now is whether we are promoting the production of psilocybin by growing whole mushrooms, which can then be processed in a number of ways. One way is to dry, create a powder in a capsule, like you're referring to. Other options for folks with different situations might be liquids, or potentially food products, things like that. So I see the product diversity question coming into play in two places. One is, what are manufacturers allowed to grow or produce? Where does that psilocybin come from? And the second is, then how is it processed or packaged for consumption by those seeking psilocybin services? Does that make sense?
okay, I think I have it. Thanks.
Does anybody else want or need clarity on what I'm suggesting? If not, would a subcommittee member like to second the vote?
Jesse, could you simply rephrase it or represent it?
Yeah, I'm
Thank you.
Yes, no problem. I'm moving that we take a straw poll on the suggestion to to promote the production of mushrooms, both mushrooms, whole mushrooms in cultivation facilities, and also hyphae. So growing the filamentous body of fungi in liquid cultures, two production mechanisms.
I'll second your motion.
Great.
And real quickly, to the in the exclusion of what other two?
Chemical synthesis and heterologous gene expression.
Thanks.
Jesse Sweet, would you like to go through the roll again, or shall I?
Sure. Starting again in the order of my screen. Jesse Euling,
Yes.
Angie Carter,
Yes.
Steph Bars,
Yes.
Mason Marks,
Yes.
and Dr. Knox.
I'm actually a no at this point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Is anybody interested in discussing potentially Dr. Knox, or no?
I had the choice to abstain or vote no, and I could have abstained, but I wasn't ready to vote yes. Simple as that.
Okie dokie. So I think at this point, we should probably save the rest of these for our next meeting, and we'll put the vote on the agenda so you know that's coming. So the topics we'll be voting on are which species of fungi, what product types producers can move forward with, substrate or cultivation techniques, and then if extracts are permitted, what kinds of solvents are allowed to be used. Any questions or comments from subcommittee or full board members before we move into public comment?
That sounds like a good plan.
Going once. All right, if not, we're going to go into our public comment period. Zach Anderson, welcome.
Hi there. I'm just wanting to make a public comment when it comes down to the restrictions of species and substrates to at least, and I don't know if you guys mentioned this within this meeting because it kind of broke in and out of service, but just kind of like creating a space where research can be developed so that way more options can be available later on. It's just a main concern within the cultivation community, trying to make sure that options can stay available and accessibility and equitability when it comes to substrates and species can be taken into consideration. But just for like more of an open, for just a basis for some kind of structure for research to be developed, so that way we can have a better understanding within safety, within using certain substrates and specific species, so that way we can see more options in the future. But I definitely think that talking about it is something that we should be doing when it comes down to especially safety, but limiting options can be difficult as well. Thank you.
Zach. All right, any other comments or discussion from the subcommittee? I think that's it for our public comments.
Yeah, I will just say, I mean, you asked for some thoughts from me, Jesse, and I just didn't have any in the moment. But one of my concerns, because on the cannabis side, we're dealing with Delta 8, we're dealing with Delta 10, we're dealing with THCO acetate, right? We're dealing with synthetics that are popping up in the market, and the issues that we're dealing with are whether to invite them in and regulate them, or allow them to continue to proliferate in the unregulated market. And I think an early conversation we had in, I think, this subcommittee was the to be proactive and preventative of driving an unregulated market in parallel to this one, simply because we didn't include, chemically synthesized product. And I don't know if, I personally don't know if we have discussed that enough for me to make my own decision and recommendation here.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying it. I appreciate that. Those are really valid points. And I think one possibility is these chemical syntheses are happening in the world, and it would be possible and actually probably more straightforward if OHA just sanctioned purchasing synthetic psilocybin from private sector. What I think that would do is displace the opportunity for Oregonians to have forward momentum economically in their businesses and opportunities for growth, which is a high priority for me. And so I thought I would just put that forward as part of my logic.
I actually disagree with that. I think diversity actually opens more opportunities for folks. It really broadens the types of enterprises and enterprising activities for people, and we don't make such restrictions. Don't get me wrong, I think guardrails would have to be set in place for, to protect against huge commercial interests coming in and participating in ways that, we don't want to have happen in Oregon. But I think that there is more opportunity than meets the eye.
Yeah, and I want to clarify, I'm not suggesting that we make one suggestion that's, in perpetuity of the way that we do things. Obviously, we have to be flexible and add more options as they become available. But I do think there's also a lot of strength in what Mason's saying, which is focusing, at least initially, on a few products and production methods could be beneficial for a number of reasons. And an important one of those is compliance. I haven't heard yet, and I'm not sure we know yet, how the interface of budgetary resources and personnel for compliance will end up working out. But I think it is a real logistical concern that we need to take into account.
Yeah.
How we launch, and equally important to your point, how we establish mechanisms for evaluating what success looks like and changing those recommendations and rules and regulations over time. That one's really important.
Huge, yes.
Yeah, so I think there is a bit of overlap in our thoughts and suggestions, and I just wanted to say I'm definitely not in favor of, making one decision and having that be what it is forever.
I think Rachel raises a really good point. There might be a way, and like you said, Jesse, there might be a way to focus on these two paths that you've mentioned, and really have with a star, add a star there, an asterisk that synthetic may be considered in the future, because the board will be, the current board members will be here for 4 years, so there's going to be plenty of time to revisit this even periodically. But we could make a clear effort to make it very clear in our recommendation that it would not foreclose other options. But I see it both ways.
Yeah, I think being prepared for the present, even I wouldn't even call it the future, is really realistic. Again, just seeing how Oregon had to revise statute, and OLCC had to respond pretty aggressively to the Delta 8 issues, and like the cannabinoid exceptionalism that we're witnessing around regulation is so chaotic, it's messy, and it could have been wholly avoided. Had people really understood the market dynamics as they were from the get-go. And I think we have enough information to know what the market dynamics are right now in the unregulated space. And I just want us to be realistic and present recommendations to OHA that prepare them to have to confront these issues, probably sooner than later.
Can you elucidate for those of us not in cannabis what delta
Yes.
means?
Yes. So cannabis across all cultivars, from hemp to marijuana, hemp and marijuana simply being regulatory designations, non-scientific, contain hundreds of phytocannabinoids. Well, I guess to date, we say about around 140 phytocannabinoids. THC and CBD just being the most abundant in these cultivars, the most studied, the most understood when it comes to the pharmacology, right? The pharmacodynamics and kinetics. And we've come into the same issues in this space where folks are chemically synthesizing cannabinoids using other substances, substrates. But now we're starting to see like true synthetic versions of cannabinoids. Delta 8 is one. The only difference between Delta 8 and Delta 9 is the bond, the double bond, right? Between the 8th and 9th carbon and the 9th and 10th carbon, respectively Delta 10, right? After the 10th carbon. But they all bind to the cannabinoid receptor 1, CB1. When you activate CB1, you create the euphoria, right? You create that intoxicating effect. And so Delta 8 is not found in cannabis in any cultivar in high enough amounts to be noticeable or effective. But what is happening are hemp cultivators synthesizing Delta 8 from CBD, right? Because the CBD market is just so oversaturated. People are finding it hard to move product and get a return on their investment. But now they can synthesize Delta 8, which is in almost to no amount naturally in the plant, at quantities to be commercially profitable. So we're starting to see Delta 8 be marketed direct to consumers outside of their compliant THC market, because it's these compliant hemp farmers and manufacturers who are using this opportunity to make a quick buck. Now, Delta 8 is intoxicating. So there's a big issue right now that people are circumventing the compliant THC space, right? They're not going to dispensaries to get Delta 9 THC. They're going to wherever, the store down the street that's selling Delta 8. And so now states are trying to figure out whether they're going to ban Delta 8, whether they're going to bring it in and regulate it. We have the Hemp Roundtable and other big, national hemp associations trying to scramble and figure out what to do. And even the latest Senate bill, the first comprehensive Senate bill to be considered to legalize cannabis at the federal level, is trying to figure out what to do with the Delta 8. Not to mention, though, that there is a Delta 10, there's a Delta a THCO acetate that's 4 times as potent as Delta 9 THC, right? So it's like the collective we are reacting to every new cannabinoid that hits the market, trying to figure out how to regulate it, instead of just taking a step back and saying, whoa, this plant has hundreds of phytochemicals, over 100 phytocannabinoids. They all have, pharmacological, biological effects. And we're going to regulate them all sensibly, right? Whether they're naturally occurring, semi-synthetic or synthetic. Because when we don't, then we inadvertently create opportunity within an unregulated or illicit marketplace, because people are still going to seek what they want.
Thank you for
Right.
explaining
Yeah.
that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. And to Zach's point, the research is really essential and largely lacking here. So I'm hoping that there's mechanisms for individuals, institutions, groups to engage in some of the necessary research behind making some of these decisions with more data in hand. All right, we're closing in on the top of the hour. Are there any other comments, questions, concerns before we wrap up here?
I don't want to belabor this, but I think just to clarify what the question is about the voting is, are there certain special types of votes that need to be noticed, or is there, because it sounds like the message I'm getting from my perspective is that some votes are okay, but maybe not others. I'm not clear on like what differentiates between the two, just things like that. I think would be helpful to have more clarity on.
Yeah, for the recording, this is Jesse Sweet again. Mason, I appreciate the need for clarity, and it's my goal to produce a definitive guidance on this. So thank you.
Awesome, thanks.
It looks as though Jesse may have had to go or have been kicked out of the room. So I will just say we can probably wrap up at this point. Any last thoughts before we close?
Nick, do we have anyone for, I'm sorry, we already did public comment and then we kind of slipped back into discussion. Sorry for the confusion. I was asking if there was anyone else signed up for public comment. I don't believe that there was.
Here's Jesse.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that. Lost you there for a second. Just in time to wrap things up though. Are we at consensus with the voting logistics? We're gonna get some more info from you, Jesse.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. Look forward to that vote next time and we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Have a good day.